Let's look at 1 Samuel chapter 20 tonight. And as we turn to 1 Samuel chapter 20, what do you all think about God's will tonight? When you pray, do you say, Lord, whatever your will is to be done, like the book of Luke? I think the book of Luke has it scattered all out. Whatever your will is, Lord. Or do you pray your will to God and want God to accept your will? Oh man, this is a rough crowd tonight. Let me see, can I do this again? Do you ask God for his will to be done? Or do you pray, Lord, allow my will to be done? And I want to be honest, since y'all are more spiritual than me, I can sense that you all are more spiritual than me. There have been times in my life where I wanted God, through prayer, to carry out my will. Okay, I lost the whole audience tonight. I mean, I did pray, and I said, Lord, let your will be done, which is really my will. I didn't quite say it that way. But there have been times in my life, years ago, that I prayed and said, Lord, I want you to just carry out my will. Okay, it wasn't years ago. It might have been last month. Okay, last week. Leave me alone. I'm growing. But there are times in my life where I really want God to carry out my will. And the reason why I want to start with that tonight is because you may be sitting there tonight, and the reason why you pray is not to ask God for his will to be done, but maybe you've been asking God to carry out your orders or your will or your plan or your purpose or your agenda. You know, it's gotten real quiet in here now. Either I'm on your street or I'm in your neighborhood. For some of you, I just sat down at your kitchen table. Whose will do you really want? Because I can be honest with you about my journey. I've enjoyed the will of God as long as he was doing what I wanted him to do. But when God was being sovereign and did something away from what I thought he should have done, there's been times I pouted and said, Lord, that's not what I want. I just want you to chew on that tonight while we discuss chapter 20. Because here we are with a brother who knows the will of God, but he's going to struggle with the will of God. And he's going to struggle with what that entails and what that means as we go through our lesson tonight. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 20, and a powerful chapter. It's a chapter that focuses in on really Jonathan. On the surface, it looks like it's focusing on David and maybe on Saul, but it's really focused on Jonathan because Jonathan has his foot in two different worlds. He's trying to serve his dad, which is the king, but he loves his homeboy, his friend, his ride or die, David. You remember back in 1 Samuel chapter 18, around verse 3, around verse 5, he said, he declared how much he loved. Their souls were knitted together. He loves David. And when he saw David, he took off his ring, his robe, his sword, gave it all to David because he saw David, even though he was the crown prince, he saw the Lord raising David up for such a time as this. Maybe he knew that God had already promised his father Saul that his dynasty would not continue, that his son would not sit on the throne. And maybe he's looking around to see who would God use to fulfill his purposes. And David's there, and David has a heart like that of Jonathan, and he wants to see God's will done. Here's what David says as we move from chapter 19 to verse chapter 20. Then David flees from Naioth and Ramah and came and said to Jonathan, what have I done? What is my iniquity? And what is my sin before your father that he is seeking my life. What have I done? And he said to him, far be it, you shall not die. Behold, my Father does nothing, either great or small, without disclosing it to me. So why should my Father hide this thing from me? It is not so. Here's David, and David sensing that his life is in jeopardy. David's wondering what he had done wrong to provoke Saul. He's wondering, why does Saul hate me so much? This is one of those great places in the Bible where I can tell you this. Just because you're doing the right thing doesn't necessarily guarantee that you'll have favor with people. It is possible for you to have favor with God and people still be jealous of you. It is possible for you to have favor with God and people are envious of you, or even desire to kill you or destroy you, even though you're doing the right thing. I was always, I don't know where I got this from. I thought if I did the right thing, this life would fall in place. And just because you do the right thing doesn't necessarily mean that life will fall in place. Sometimes walking with God can be very confusing. I want to say that again for the people in the back row. Sometimes walking with God can be very confusing. And we need to learn the lesson that David learned. When we try to walk with God and follow him faithfully, we need to realize that some people will be in our life to oppose his will. I think some people will be in our lives to antagonize us. And it's not the result of our sinfulness or something that we've done wrong. That's just how the evil one works. When you're walking with him, he doesn't necessarily fire at you. But when you're walking in the opposite direction from the evil one, he's got to send everything your way to try to discourage you, isolate you, and to separate you. Are you all with me here tonight? And I just want to remind you from the life of David tonight, if you're looking at this, David says, what have I done? David, you haven't done anything wrong. What is my iniquity? David, you haven't sinned. Nothing's wrong. And what is my sin before your Father that he is seeking my life? You're breathing, David. You're breathing. You're still alive. Okay, this side is sleep. Y'all with me over there? You're still alive, David. That's what you did wrong. Oh, y'all remember that song, don't you? Saul slays his 1,000, but David his 10,000. That's the song right there. See, David, you're still alive. That's the problem. And why does your father want to kill me? David, you're breathing. But Jonathan says, my dad won't do anything without checking with me first, without disclosing it to me. And why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so. This is one of those chapters in the Bible where I say that Jonathan is, clueless. He's naive. He thinks he knows his father's heart. And little does he know, he doesn't know everything. Verse 3 says, yet David vowed again, saying, your father knows well that I have found favor in your sight. And he has said, do not let Jonathan know this, or he will be grieved. But truly as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, there is hardly a step between me and death. Translation, Jonathan, your daddy wants to kill me. Then verse 4, then Jonathan said to David, whatever you say, I will do for you. In other words, he's saying, I don't believe it. I don't think it's like this. But whatever you want me to do, I'll do it for you. Did you all notice the oath that was taken in verse 3? I think it's one of the most fascinating oaths in all of Scripture. Here's what David vowed again. He said, your father knows well that I have found favor in your sight. And he said, do not let Jonathan know this or he will be grieved. But here's where the vow comes in. But truly as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, there's hardly a step between me and death. You know, this chapter should be a chapter of vows and affirmations. Because you see it in verse 3, you see it in verse 12, you see it in verse 13, you see it in verse 17, you see it in verse 23, verse 42. These guys love one another. And I appreciate that. Verse 5 says, so David said to Jonathan, behold, tomorrow is the new moon, and I ought to sit down to eat with the king. But let me go, that I may hide myself in the field until the third evening. Wait a minute, why can't you hide in a building? Maybe because there are some people in the buildings that are loyal to Saul and will reveal David's whereabouts. So he said, let me hide in the field. Maybe that old shepherd that's in David comes out. He'll hide in the field. If your father misses me at all, then say, David earnestly asked leave of me to run to Bethlehem, his city, because it is the yearly sacrifice there for the whole family. In other words, David wants to skip out on the king's meal and go home and attend a family reunion, a time of sacrifice for the family. Now, looks to me like, wait a minute, let me check it out, make sure. Looks to me like in verse 6, there's what I call a lie on the scene. And I want to ask you all a question tonight. Is it ever okay to lie? Well, let me ask that question again. Is it ever, why y'all pushing me tonight? Is it ever okay to lie? I remember back in Joshua that Rahab, she lied. Was it okay because the spies were hiding out in her brothel and wanting to make sure they get back safely, and she lied? Was it okay then? Is it ever okay to lie? Well, this is one of the great dilemmas of Scripture. David told a lie. He didn't go to Bethlehem. He was going to be in the field, but he got his lie together. You know, here's what I think about this, and can I give you my honest theological opinion? The reason why David lied here is because maybe he forgot that God had already promised, God had already anointed him to be the next king. Maybe he forgot that he has God's favor in his life and on his life. Maybe he forgot, maybe he thought that God needs some help. You know, God needs some help every now and then, so I have to tell a lie to help God out. Does God need our help, church? God doesn't need our help. And you know what I love about this? That you'll notice as David goes through trial after trial, at first we see that David will tell one every now and then. He'll tell a lie. But as he matured with God, the lies somehow went away. You know, as we go through trials in our life and we learn how to trust God more, we learn how to lie a whole lot less. I'm going to say amen to my own teaching. You know, in James chapter 1, he reminds us that as we go through these various trials, they do something to our faith. Now, can anybody, don't raise your hand, don't nod your head, don't do anything, just look at me like you're looking at me. Can anybody look in the rearview mirror of your life and see God's faithfulness in your life? And see how God has brought you to this point in your life? And you know, if it had not been for God in your life, you don't know where you'd be. But God has been so faithful. He's been so good. God has been so outstanding in your life that you can look back and say, you know, if God's done it in the past, I know he can do it right now. And that's where I feel tonight. If God has done it in the past, you know God can do it again. And you don't have to resort to lying. You don't have to resort to scheming. You don't have to resort to trickery. You know that God will take care of you. You got to believe that tonight. And as you grow in your faith and you know God will take care of you, you don't have to lie anymore. Lord, I trust you. I trust you even when I can't trace you. And here's David. He's got a little lie going on now. But we realize that his trials help him. So David proposed, verse 7 now, If he says it is good, your servant will be safe. But if he is very angry, know that he has decided on evil. Therefore, deal kindly with your servant. For you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. But if there is iniquity in me, put me to death yourself. For why then should you bring me to your father? Man, David, I love David. David says, you think there's something in me that ain't right? I want you to kill me. I want you to take care of me. You don't have to take me to your father for that. He reminds him of the love that he has. And we're reminded of 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 3 and 4. He appealed. He appealed to that covenant that he first made with him. And he asked Jonathan to do it himself. If I have to die, I want you to be the one to do it. You know, don't ever take your eyes off what God is doing in your life. Here's Jonathan in verse 9 and 10. Jonathan said, far be it from you. For if I should indeed learn that evil has been decided by my father to come upon you, then would I not tell you about it? Wow. You know, he predicted that everything's going to be all right. My father's not out to kill you. Then David said to Jonathan, who will tell me if your father answers you harshly? And then verse 11, before I make another comment, Jonathan said to David, come and let us go out into the field. So both of them went out to the field. Maybe they're going out to the field because they don't want anybody to hear their conversation. Maybe they want to get away from the Secret Service. Maybe they want to get away from the spies in the castle. They want to get out and they want to talk to one another and they want to communicate the plan. Verse 12, then Jonathan said to David, the Lord your God of Israel be witness. When I have sounded out my father about this time tomorrow on the third day, because the festival of the new moon lasted for 3 days. First day was kind of a silent day, but the last 2 days of the new moon, they would have a feast together with the king. So that was the second day and the third day. Here's Jonathan saying, by this time tomorrow, on the third day, behold, if there's a good feeling toward David, shall I not then send to you and make it known to you? If it please my father to do harm, may the Lord do to Jonathan, and more also, if I do not make it known to you and send you away, that you may go in safety. And may the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. Isn't that a strange comment in verse 13? May the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. You know, I was reading a book one time, and it suggested the has-been clauses of the Old Testament. As he has been with my father. Not is still presently with my father, but as he has been with my father. Jonathan appealed to the oath of the Lord. He was indicating that this is a serious time. Verse 12 and verse 13. The Lord, the God of Israel, be witness. He wants there to be the strongest witness of all of heaven. The Lord, your God of Israel. When I have sounded out my father, when I've searched the mind of my father, when I see what my father's going to do with this, by this time tomorrow, the third day, behold, if there's a good feeling toward David, shall I not send to you and make it known to you? I mean, he has faith and confidence as a father, but he's also loyal to David. You know, these verses indicate clearly that Jonathan believed David would somehow be king one day and subdue his enemies, even if his enemy is his father. Look at verse 15 for just a second. Verse 14 and 15. If I am still alive, will you not show me the loving kindness of the Lord, that I may not die? You shall not cut off your loving kindness from my house forever. This is called hesek in the Hebrew. Not even when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. Can you remember your faithfulness toward me? Can you remember that covenant? And may you deal with my descendants as you've dealt with me. He wants some security as it relates to the future, as it relates to his household. And we know that later on in 2 Samuel chapter 9, he's going to show that loving kindness to a young man by the name of Mephibosheth, who Mephibosheth has come from a broken family, from a broken land, a broken family, and he's going to have broken legs. But yet he's going to eat at David's table for the rest of his life. That's the faithfulness of God there. You shall not cut off your loving kindness from my house forever. What a covenant. Verse 16. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord require it at the hands of David's enemies. This is how strong, how binding this covenant is. May the Lord require it at the hands of David's enemies. Verse 17 and 18. Jonathan made David vow again because of his love for him, because he loved him as he loved his own life. Then Jonathan said to him, tomorrow the new moon, and you will be missed because your seat will be empty. You see, David would have a preferred seat because he's one of Saul's mighty men, because he's one of Saul's warriors. He's one of his top commanders. You remember he put him over thousands, and he was able to, he thought he was cutting his influence off. He gave him more influence with the men. So everybody would have noticed where David was sitting. And he would be missed because his chair would be empty. Verse 19 and 20. When you stay for 3 days, you should go down quickly and come to the place where you hide yourself on that eventful day, and you shall remain at the stones of Ezel. Now, we don't know where that stone is today, but here's the deal. In verse 20 it says, I will shoot 3 arrows to the side as though I shot at a target. And behold, I will send the lad, saying, go find the arrows. If I specifically say to the lad, behold, the arrows are on this side of you, get them, then come, for their safety for you, and no harm, as the Lord lives. But if I say to the youth, behold, the arrows are beyond you, go, for the Lord has sent you away, as the agreement of which you and I have made, or have spoken, behold, the Lord is between you and me forever. So you get it here? He's going to fire 3 arrows. Why not 1? Because if he does 1, maybe someone will get curious. Why 3? Because they're just having target practice. Why lad? And this particular word, this lad word here, this is not only someone that's 17 and below, but this is probably someone that's 12 and below. Maybe someone that he can teach how to shoot. Wait a minute. Or maybe someone that won't ask too many questions. Just go and get the arrows and don't ask any questions. Because the older you are, you're like, why are we out here? Why are we shooting these arrows? Why are you making me run beyond the arrow? I mean, what are you doing? But maybe he wants someone young enough and naive enough not to ask any questions. And you all know what happened. David went and hid in the field. New moon came according to verse 24. Verse 25, the king said in his usual, and do you notice this in verse 25? You military people will love this. It said in verse 25, the king sat on his seat as usual, the seat by the wall. In other words, he wouldn't sit unless his back was to the wall. Why would he sit with his back toward the wall? Because he didn't want anybody to slip up behind him and try to kill him. So he sat with his back to the wall. When I'm out with my wife at dinner, oftentimes, she said, I know where you want to sit. I said, where do I want to sit? She said, you want to see where you can see the door. You want to sit with your back to the wall. I tried it one night to let her sit on the other side. It didn't quite work that well. I didn't even make it to the appetizer. Then Jonathan rose up and Abner sat down by Saul's side. But David's place was empty, according to verse 25. Nevertheless, Saul didn't speak anything on that day, for he thought it is an accident. He is not clean. Surely he is not clean. In other words, he must have lost his mind to think he could skip my dinner. But I'm going to give him grace tonight because maybe he's not clean, because you need to be clean in order to eat at the king's table. Okay, I'm going to give him a break tonight. But it came the next day, the second day of the new moon, and David's spot was still empty. So Saul said to his son Jonathan, why has the son of Jesse, did he not know his name? Wait a minute, let me ask this out over here. Did he know his name? Why did he call him son of Jesse? Because he was sending out a little insult, a little shot across the bow. Where is Jesse's son at? He says, why has the son of Jesse not come to the meal either, watch this, he took attendance the day before, yesterday, or when? Today. Jonathan then answered, Saul, what was that lie again? David earnestly asked leave of me to go to Bethlehem. For he says, please let me go, since our family has a sacrifice in the city, and my brother commanded me to attend. Why does his brother send for him and not Jesse? Maybe the text is revealing to us that Jesse may be dead by now, and the oldest son is taking over. It's hard to know exactly what's going on. And he says, if I found favor in your sight, please let me go away to see my brothers. For this reason, he has not come to the king's table. Wow. Now it gets interesting. Y'all ready? Now, Pastor Hoppy, I've given the G version so far of this lesson tonight. It's going to get a little bit more heated now before we finish the chapter. So y'all kind of stick with me now. Y'all ready? Then Saul's anger burned against Jonathan, and he said to him, you son, it's a little stronger in the Hebrew than it is in the English here. He called him some really, really bad names. You son of a perverse, rebellious woman. And you can tell by the rhythm of it what he really said. Do I not know that you are choosing the son of Jesse? Did he not know the guy's name? The son of Jesse, to your own shame and the shame of your mother's nakedness? You son of a gun. For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Therefore now, send and bring him to me, for he must surely, wait a minute now. So he's going to find out for the very first time, because his father's going to reveal his will, that he wants David dead. You remember how I started out tonight? Do you enjoy the will of God? Do you like the will of God? Oh, yes, I love the will of God. But what if God wants to use someone else instead of you? What if they have more giftedness than you? What if they have more favor with people than you? What if God wants to use somebody else besides you? Are you okay with that? And Saul says, no, I'm not okay with that. I want my son to be on the throne. I want my dynasty to continue. I want my legacy to continue. But what happens when God's will goes in a different direction from yours? And Jonathan answered his father, Saul, his father, and said to him, verse 32, Why should he be put to death? What has he done? Fool, he's trying to take your kingdom. And then Saul, none of you all would do this. I know this. I know nobody here would do this, right? He hurled his spear at him to strike him down. So Jonathan knew that his father had decided to put David to death. Wait a minute. Saul is always holding this spear in his hand. Didn't he throw it at David a few weeks ago? He threw it at David, but it's getting personal now. Listen, church. He's throwing the spear at his own son. Are you all hearing me good here? I mean, it's one thing to throw it at one of the employees, one of the servants, but when you start throwing it at your flesh and blood, you see, he wasn't cool. He wasn't cool with his son accepting the will of God. And he wasn't cool accepting the will of God. Verse 34, then Jonathan rose from the table in fierce anger, and he did not eat. And on the second day of the new moon, for he was grieved over David because his father had dishonored him. Wow. Now next morning they got up and they shot those arrows. And of course he told the lad to go beyond. And David knew that it didn't work. Verse 40, if you can drop down to verse 40. Then Jonathan gave his weapons to the lad and he said, go, bring them to the city. And the Bible says here, when the lad had gone, David arose from the south side and fell on his face to the ground and bowed 3 times. And they kissed one another, each other, and they wept. But David wept more. You see, David still wanted to honor Jonathan. Jonathan realized David is God's choice. And David still wants to honor Jonathan. And here's how it ends. Jonathan said to David, go in safety, inasmuch as we have sworn to each other in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord will be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever. Then he rose and departed, while Jonathan went into the city. This is such a sad ending to this chapter because Jonathan really thought his daddy wanted to do what was right. But I think we already knew. We already knew that his dad wasn't interested in the will of God. Brothers and sisters, can I ask you a question? How do you feel about the will of God? Do you find yourself opposing the will of God from time to time? Do you find yourself like Saul, opposing the will of God? Saying, you know what? I like it when it's in my favor, but I don't like it when it's not doing what I want it to do. The will of God. And not only did he oppose the will of God, but he opposed the one that God had anointed as well. Not only did he oppose him, but he started even opposing his own son. How do you feel about the will of God tonight? You know, that's why I really love Jonathan. Jonathan humbled himself before God's will, and he supported God's anointed. God, if this is your choice, I'm following you. Jonathan faced the tension between Saul's attitude and being loyal to David. And you know what I like about Jonathan in this moment? Jonathan knows how to put God first. He knows how to submit to domestic authority, and that was that of his father, to the civil authority of the king by obeying Saul. Yet, when obedience to Saul conflicted with the will of God, he followed the will of God. And you know what? We should always do what our leaders would have us to do, our governmental, civic leaders. But whenever it opposes the will of God, we should always follow what God would have us to do. Now, in chapter 20, Jonathan tried to be an advocate for David. David, it's not that bad. My father wouldn't do anything against you unless he ran it by me first. Do you think Jonathan got the point? When he saw that spear coming at him, I think he got the point. I don't know if you know this, but I really appreciated that he departed from David and he went back to his father. And he should have. Because he realized that he could be loyal to David by yet serving his father. Well, this is a tough chapter, and I'm going to tell you why it's a tough chapter. Because I'm looking through the rest of the book. I think we only see Jonathan and David together one other brief instance before Jonathan's killed at the end of the book. But yet, David remains loyal to him and loyal to his descendants for the rest of his life. Well, I'm going to my seat now, but I want to ask this one more time because I think I've given you all something to think about because I got some things to think about too. Do you really appreciate the will of God? Even when the will of God is in direct opposition to your will? I was talking to one of my students a few years ago, and he was in the Marine Corps, and he was serving in Afghanistan. And while he was serving in Afghanistan, one of those bombs hit their vehicle, and the vehicle was blown up. Several guys died, but he was paralyzed from the waist down. And he was in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. And I asked him one day, I said, how is it being in a wheelchair? And he said, he called me Prof. He said, I'm just thankful to be alive. And obviously it was God's will, because God has opened up some doors in this wheelchair that I never would have been exposed to if I was just walking around. And I said, wow, that's a great attitude. A few years later, I attended his funeral. And the only thing I could think about during his funeral was this guy appreciate the will of God for his life. Never any regrets. Had this other guy, though. Met him a few years ago, and he was down on his luck. He had just lost his job, and he blamed God for losing his job. He was mad with God. Very talented, very gifted, lost his job. And I said, well, you can get another job. He said, but I was making good money at that job, and da. He was just angry because he felt like God, with 4 kids and a wife at home, God had caused him to lose his job. And he was just bitter, and no matter what I said to him, he couldn't get over that it was God that caused him to lose his job. A few days later, I guess he was so bitter with God that he took his own life because he couldn't accept the will of God for his life. You know, there are a lot more Sauls in our church than we know. Because we're cool with God's will as long as he's blessing us, or in our minds blessing us, or giving us what we want. When he's handing out candy and giving out blessings, when he's keeping us in good health. But can you appreciate God when things are going south, when you're not his chosen one to go up next? Can you still appreciate the will of God? I'm growing in this, and as I read the life of David, and as I read the life of Saul, as I read the life of Samuel, David, Saul, as I read these guys' life, I said, Lord, help me in my attitude to never become entitled. Help me to never become, Lord, you gotta do this. Let me be humble enough to say, God, whatever your will is for my life, I will accept it. Now, Father, I pray tonight that if anybody finds their attitude like that of Saul, maybe a little paranoid, maybe a fearing that someone's trying to take their life, if anybody finds themselves with that hard attitude tonight, God, that you would use this lesson to turn them back toward you, to trust you like that of Jonathan, to trust you like that of David, to trust you even when they can't trace you, because your will is to be preferred over anything over any agenda or any purpose or whatever we think should happen with our lives. May we never get to the point where we feel entitled, but let it be about you. In Christ's name I pray, amen.